Good morning. Thank you for joining us for today's class. Today, I'll be speaking about pancreatic pseudocysts. The outline of the talk will proceed as follows. To start with an introduction, I'll go briefly over a natural history and pathogenesis, clinical features, diagnosis and its differential diagnosis. A very important part is when to intervene, treatment options that are available to us, and end with an algorithmic approach to how to manage a pseudocyst. So, starting off, a pseudocyst is a localized enzyme-rich fluid collection with a well-defined but non-epithelialized wall. We see pseudocysts are seen in about 40% cases of chronic pancreatitis, about 10 to 15% cases of acute pancreatitis. Other less common etiologies include trauma and surgery, post-surgical. Pseudocysts form the most common pancreatic cystic lesions that present to us. So I went through a few books, and Mango seems to be the most definitive, which says that pseudocyst, for formation of a pseudocyst, a ductal disruption is definitely required.
Just check with one of the students that
Can everyone hear me? Can you please type in the message or reply? Can you guys hear me?
who are the participants?
Kapil, Siddharth, Lokesh, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can.
All right, good. Thank you.
वो छोटा बेकर संभाल लेते हैं ना छोटा बेकर
क्या है नहीं वर्ष थे
ऐसे से
Right. Now, how do pseudocysts present? They're either diagnosed at the time of the pancreatitis. Patients got an early CT scan. We see an acute fluid collection and follow it up, and we know that there are pseudocysts. Otherwise, if they're diagnosed later on, they're either because of a persistence of symptoms, which can be pain most commonly, or there can be new onset symptoms in the form of mass effects and commonly GI intolerance. Biochemically, this is represented as a secondary rise in lipase or amylase. Lipase is more common. Literature is two interesting things. I did not know this myself. Is that pseudocysts are more likely to develop in alcoholic chronic pancreatitis and biliary acute pancreatitis. So both pancreatitis in alcohol and biliary in acute pancreatitis, the incidence of pseudocyst is higher. Now, this is from the revised Atlanta classification in 2012. We all know this. So it's temporal, less than 4 weeks, any fluid collection which is clean and does not have any necrosis, called an acute pancreatic fluid collection. Any component of necrosis is included, less than 4 weeks, it's called an acute necrotic collection. Once this arbitrary 4-week time gap is crossed, time interval is crossed, they're called either pancreatic pseudocysts or a walled-off pancreatic necrosis. It is important to note that each of these modalities can either be sterile or be infected. Now, this is a classification that was given by Neelan, and I found this to be very useful in literature. So he has divided pseudocysts and fluid collections into 4 types based on the morphology of the pancreatic duct. Type 1 has a normal main pancreatic duct. Type 2 has a pancreatic ductal stricture. Type 3 has a pancreatic duct occlusion or a disconnected duct syndrome. Type 4 represents chronic pancreatitis. Each of these is subtyped as A or B depending on the absence or the presence of ductal communication. So the other ways in which pancreatitis presents are infection in pseudocysts presents are infections. So about 10 to 20% of all pseudocysts get infected. Shashank, can you mute your screen? Can you mute your device, please, Shashank? Shashank, thank you. So 10 to 20% of pseudocysts are get infected. That is more commonly associated in necrotizing pancreatitis. Earlier, before 2012, these were called as pancreatic abscesses, and this led to a significant increase in the mortality of acute pancreatitis. Alternatively, a pseudocyst may present as bleeding, in which there is an erosion into either the GI tract or a direct invasion into the visceral vasculature, which presents as a pseudoaneurysm, commonly either in the three main vessels around the area, splenic, gastroduodenal, or the middle colic. This risk of bleeding increases with infection, and it is a complication with a high mortality of about 20%. What we more commonly see is the mass effect. Now, a pseudocyst may grow to be very large in size, and it may cause early satiety, as we see here, because the stomach is compressed, may cause intestinal obstruction. It can cause a CBD obstruction, and it's important to note that even venous thrombosis, which is there, splenic vein, superior mesenteric or portal vein, can be secondary to this mass effect or to localized inflammation. Another less common presentation is a rupture in which the pancreatic pseudocyst either erodes into an adjacent organ. This can herald in the form of an internal fistulization. If it's in the GI lumen, there is a high likelihood of hemorrhage. If it is into the peritoneal cavity, this is an acute abdomen that presents with peritonitis and signs similar to peritonitis, and this patient has pancreatic ascites. So how do we diagnose a pseudocyst? Now, most commonly, most of these patients are going to undergo an ultrasound, which is the most commonly used modality. It's important to note one very important thing here. The sensitivity and specificity of picking up a pseudocyst is high, so about 90% plus sensitivity and specificity. But the negative predictive value, which is if I don't see something on an ultrasound and there is no pseudocyst, is less than 10%. So a pseudocyst cannot be ruled out on the basis of an ultrasound. But if I see a cystic lesion in the pancreas, I can diagnose it with a fair degree of certainty that it is in fact a pseudocyst. Additional Doppler, if done, can provide us additional information in the form of vasculature and nearby patency of vessels. Now, EUS is used, just continuing with the ultrasonic bit, an EUS is used as an adjunct to a CT. It is superior to a CT in one or two conditions, one of which is lesions which are less than 2 centimeters. It is useful for identification of debris inside the pseudocyst. It provides us with characteristics of the cyst as well as fluid for cyst analysis. A CT forms a mainstay of treatment, a mainstay of planning for treatment. It has amongst the highest sensitivity and specificity for diagnosing a pseudocyst, and as we can see, is very useful for us to differentiate a pseudocyst from a walled-off pancreatic necrosis. A pseudocyst will have a clear homogeneous fluid, whereas a walled-off pancreatic necrosis will have a heterogeneous possible air foci and possible infection in its contents. Now, what do we look for in a CT? One, we look for features of a pseudocyst, the size, the shape, the wall thickness, and the contents. Next, we look at the nature of the pancreas. Is there any coexistent necrosis? What is the presence and the extent of that necrosis? What is the diameter of the pancreatic duct, which we'll see further on, helps plan our treatment planning. With the chronic pancreatitis, such as atrophy and calcification of the pancreas. Also, we look for is its relationship to surrounding organs, which will help treatment planning, and any other complications of the pseudocyst. Now, as we see here, I've brought this up because this is a very well-defined pseudocyst, very well. But we see that the wall, however, is not well formed. So this CT is going to give us a good idea of the wall maturity. Generally, anything above 4 weeks, we have a wall of about 3 to 4 millimeters, but there are exceptions. Important in treatment planning of acute pancreatitis-related pseudocysts, not so much in chronic pancreatitis, where walls are better formed. The other thing, it will give us an idea of the shape of the pseudocyst. Now this is the shaped pseudocyst, which will require a different drainage procedure as compared to one which was localized to only one side.
The CT.
Yes.
This is a very important slide, students, from your point of view, because very often in the exam, when we show you a CT, you just say there is a pseudocyst. That is not enough. So keep all these points in mind when you read a CT scan showing a pseudocyst. In the first instance, you must describe all these things. Even if they are not there, you should say that I have looked for all these things and they are not there. So don't just say pseudocyst and stop. And then let the examiner ask you two supplementary questions. So the first description, the complete description of the
The next modality is an ERCP or an MRCP, which is predominantly done to identify ductal communication between the cyst and the pancreatic duct. This ductal communication can be seen in about 40 to 70% of pseudocysts. But ERCP has traditionally remained the gold standard for diagnosing this communication. Because of its invasive nature, there's a potential and therefore definite risk of converting a sterile pseudocyst into an infected pseudocyst during its manipulation. MRCP can provide us close and similar sensitivity and specificity without the invasive nature. Why it is important is because there are now 2 or 3 studies which have shown, even as far back as 1985, we have seen studies have seen that if we don't find out the ductal status of a pseudocyst prior to draining it or prior to managing it, we might incorrectly treat about 1/3 of these patients. So it's important to note that ductal integrity, ductal communication is important before planning the next treatment step.
But would that statement hold true today?
I think I'd like
Only
to
for diagnosis.
Yeah. See, ERCP for diagnosis is just not done. MRCP, maybe the kind of pictures we have just seen and illustrated are rarely seen in real life. On MRCP, you are not able to really figure out the communication very clearly. So I think the place for ERCP is actually in management, and when it comes to management, we can touch upon it. Communicating, non-communicating, transpapillary, transmural approaches to draining collections and WOPN. So at that point, yes, you can come in. But I think while your point of the importance of ductal communication is well taken, but to just merely for that demonstration, one doesn't do any RCP. No, I just did one yesterday, and in this build, the attempt is to cross the site of leak, get a wire across, and bridge the leak. So endoscopic management, which we'll probably touch upon in the later slides.
So one question, sir. It is important. I'm not saying ERCP is to be done in all cases. I'm saying, do we need to demonstrate ductal communication or absence or presence in all pseudocysts prior to treatment?
Basically, it depends on the line of management you're choosing. If you're choosing non-surgical management, then it can be mandatory to show the communication. To attempt a drainage and the drainage is not possible, I think you will find now DPDS, disconnected pancreatic duct syndrome. About 10 to 20% you are able to cross the site of leak and bridge the leak. In the remainder, the wire goes into the retroperitoneum into the collection and you achieve a transpapillary drainage of the collection. You leave a stent or an ENPD in, which serves partly for management. Most often patients come to us referred with a percutaneous transgastric catheter placed by the interventional radiologist, and they have not bothered. They have had a cyst collection put in the catheter, and it converts into an external pancreatic fistula, which is continuously leaking pancreatic juice. So then the place for endoscopic management comes in, and maybe we'll touch upon it later in the course of the day.
No,
I think from the student's point of view, 2 things, that for most biliary and pancreatic diseases, diagnostic ERCP today very not MRCP gives you all the information. So whether it is radiological intervention or endoscopic intervention, it is invariably done as a part of the post therapeutic intervention. As long as you are draining the cyst into a viscous, it doesn't matter. You are not draining it to a viscous, then it is it.
Agreed.
Because if there is a ductal communication and you drain it externally, then it is not persistent.
Agreed. Point is taken. Now, before we proceed with the therapeutic modalities, it's important to note that not all cystic lesions in the pancreas are benign. While the most common lesion, of course, is the pseudocyst, 10% of pseudocysts will have ill-defined features that are similar to cystic tumors. And they may be in this order: mucinous, which is most commonly infused, serous, and an IPMN.
This also is very important because, see, if an MS student on a image makes a diagnosis of pseudocyst, it is okay with me. But at your level, unless it is a very well circumscribed pseudocyst with no solid component, there is a definite history of acute or chronic pancreatitis or trauma. But if there is any doubt, you have to bring cystic neoplasms of the pancreas into discussion at some stage when you are discussing it. So that's very, very important.
Let me just add a quick word I can add to that now. I think with the advent of endoscopic ultrasound, a very large number of incidental cystic lesions in the head of the pancreas of variable size are being identified. And there is still a lack of unanimity on what ought to be the proper approach. And in this situation, differentiating between early cystic neoplasms, cystic mucinous cystadenoma or cystadenocarcinoma versus pseudocyst becomes a dilemma. And I think recently there have been European Society guidelines that have been put out to tell how to approach these problems. And there may be a place for an EUS guided aspiration of cyst contents and analysis of cyst contents for helping differentiation. But yes, these are in a limited number and small number.
So just for the students, it's a good picture of what the 4 types of cystic lesions in the pancreas look like. So this is our pseudocyst, and a pseudocyst is unilocular and a single cyst, which can be confused with an IPMN or a rare unilocular serous cystadenoma. A serous cystadenoma typically will look like this. It's a honeycomb appearance, the central scar. A macrocystic mucinous cystadenoma will look as in the third picture. This may, with or without ductal communication, will differentiate between a mucinous and an IPMN. If there is a cystic component with a solid mural component in the body which enhances, then we have a differential. We need to rule out our differential is either a WOPN. Along with that, we need to rule out either an IPMN, mucinous cystadenoma, SPEN, or an adenocarcinoma with cystic degeneration as well. So as we can see, cystic lesion can present in a number of lesions can present at a cystic lesion. So it's important to differentiate them prior to initiating treatment.
Whatever entity Shaswat I'd like to add, cystic degeneration in a neuroendocrine tumor.
Okay.
That's also quite frequent.
Okay.
And can look like a cystic neoplasm rather than a pseudocyst.
That will present as the 4th one as well, sir?
Yes.
That will present also the 4th.
Solid.
As a solid and mix. Okay. Just this slide, there's too much text. I just brought it up just to show that there is definitely an age-related relation with malignancy. A younger patient is going to have a higher likelihood of a pseudocyst or rarely a SPEN, whereas an older patient will have a higher likelihood, and an older or a female patient has a higher likelihood of having a cystic neoplasm. Now, as I was discussing, an EUS guided fluid analysis is used to differentiate between these lesions. As we know, a pseudocyst has a high amylase content, but there is a low CEA and mucin. That's typical of a pseudocyst. A serous cystadenoma will have a low CEA, low amylase with no mucin. A mucinous cystic neoplasm will have a high CEA with a low amylase, and mucin will be present usually. And an IPMN will have a low to high CEA, a high amylase, important to note, a high amylase because of its ductal communication, and along with mucin. So this is just a picture to show what are different cystic components, and this is not an EUS, but just to show that the cyst contents may either be clear, as in the first one, may be turbid, or may be bloody, depending on how the cyst's natural history has progressed. So the interesting thing I myself did not know, it's an endoscopic string sign. Now it's a very simple test and very effective. if we just, I think I remember this from gynecology, we should do a spin Barkett test, very similar to that. If we just take the fluid that we have aspirated and we stretch it out between the thumb and the index finger, anything more than 1 centimeter, 1.5 centimeter has a high likelihood of it being mucinous. And it's very interesting what I found that the specificity and sensitivity were above 80%, which is a very good basic test that can be done on bedside, clinical bedside, that can be used to differentiate mucin from other tumors. Now, natural history is a question which is very difficult to answer. Many people from many decades have been trying to answer it. I'm going to try my hand at it. So historically, they were all in the 80s, and I said historically 70s, 80s, we thought pseudocysts had a high rate of complications. The reason for that was because abdominal imaging was poor, because we would only pick up those lesions which were complicated. Now, as we're picking up more and more lesions in the early phase of acute pancreatitis, we've been able to show that a large proportion of them show spontaneous resolution. What's unlikely to resolve spontaneously are large cysts that continue to expand after 6 weeks and which shows some evidence of ductal anomalies.
That's important. Rather than enlarging cyst is more important. If for a period of time it is enlarging, that is probably less likely to resolve.
सभी को म्यूट कर दो, म्यूट हो सर क्या
Those can also mute it directly.
यस सर हाँ
कहाँ पे होता है?
Coming to the site of the cyst, it's unlikely to resolve today, depending upon whether the cyst is at the head of the tail. In Bloomgard, there is a line. Head cyst versus tail cyst. Some used to spontaneously resolve, some not.
See, spontaneous resolution, you have to be very clear what we're talking about. Resolution in 1 week, 1 month, 1 year, what is your outcome? You wait long enough, it will resolve in a large one. But the risk of complications while awaiting spontaneous resolution should dictate your management. And as Dr. Shashwat has just said, anything more than 6 centimeters, it is unlikely to resolve in a reasonable period of time. Larger cysts may remain static, but the longer you wait, once I remember waiting for almost 15 months for a large asymptomatic cyst in a young person to resolve, and it didn't. Then finally, after that time, he developed pain, infection, and he developed a splenic vein thrombosis, and we had to intervene. So I think a spontaneous resolution needs to be better characterized, but the point that has been made are that it is uncommon in large cysts, particularly if it is expanding, if the cyst is symptomatic, or if any complication develops, then you should be looking at, while you are expectantly awaiting resolution of a cyst, when to intervene.
But sir, just to intervene, the concept of intervention in a large cyst more than 6 centimeters is now changing. In spite of having a large cyst, you may not intervene because it is less likely to complicate. If it is a large cyst with symptoms or expanding cyst, these are now the restricted indications over a period of time, which has changed now. So it is no more just like large cyst.
Yes, agreed. It has to be symptomatic. Symptoms may be bowel compression, biliary compression, or complications of infection or bleeding. Then you have to intervene without any question.
Now, I'm going to go over 2 studies which have been cited multiple times and form the basis of all of our management strategies. The first one is from Neelan, and this is from 2009, one of the largest series of pseudocysts. So he compared the study population was 563 patients. He had a resolution of only about 142% of them, about 30%. What's important to note, and I'll go over these again. So type 1 is a normal pancreatic duct. Type 2 has a pancreatic ductal stricture. Type 3 has an obstruction or a disconnected duct syndrome. Type 4 is chronic pancreatitis. Now, when you look at the results again, we see most of these patients who have acute pancreatitis related pseudocysts resolve. And this falls dramatically in patients who have any ductal anomalies. When we move on to treatment, we see percutaneous drainage is very successful in patients who have a normal pancreatic duct. It is somewhat successful in patients who have a ductal stricture, and it is not successful if there is a disconnected duct or a chronic pancreatitis type picture. In patients of severe acute pancreatitis, now these patients, again we see that if there is any evidence of ductal anomaly, our success of percutaneous drainage decreases drastically. And a much higher proportion of these patients, which is only 40% in type 1, goes up to double, and 80% require operative debridement if there are associated ductal anomalies.
But Professor Saraswat, I mean, this probably doesn't hold true today because anything which can be drained percutaneously, you would prefer to drain endoscopically into the discus.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think this area has had a lot of endoscopic literature coming out in the last few years. In fact, last year there was a series of over 100 patients from the Asian Institute, and we also reviewed and presented our data of about 60 patients with disconnected pancreatic duct syndrome, and almost 90% of them were in the setting of acute pancreatitis. Chronic pancreatitis with the DPDS or with the pseudocyst collections now are becoming increasingly uncommon. And as Professor Kapoor has said, I think gradually the paradigm is moving towards non-invasive management as far as possible, which with the appearance of now LAMPs, that is lumen opposing metal stents, endoscopic guided drainage where you can avoid vessels, etc. That is becoming the first line of management by and large in most situations. And surgical backup is obviously invariably required, especially when the complications appear, there is bleeding, or we had recently a patient with a large viscous connection. There was a big hole connecting the cyst to the duodenum at the apex of the bug, you can see there. So that did need intervention. So I think
we'll cover
it by now.
Yeah. So one term which Professor Saraswat used, I hope all students got it, LAMPs, lumen opposing, which means that the two lumina are opposed, and all surgical students must be fully aware of the recent advances in endoscopy. And I think sometime in December, I've already requested Dr. Saraswat to tell us about what the recent advances is, because the basics of endoscopy, all surgical gastroenterology students must know.
Is covering one more study about the clinical course of pancreatic fluid collections. So this was a patient of about 300 patients of acute pancreatitis who did and did not have fluid collections. About 129 of these patients developed fluid collections, which is about 40%. And we see about 70% of them resolved. On the right, if we see this picture, 70% of them resolved. About 15% of them ended up developing pseudocysts, and only a small proportion, only 2 of these patients ended up developing complications. So this might be smaller than what's supported in literature. What I'm trying to say is that most of these fluid collections will resolve. Now moving on to the next step, when do we intervene? As we've discussed, the intervention is not done in all patients. We intervene when the patient has symptoms. Those symptoms can be in the form of pain, postprandial fullness, and early satiety, the most commonly. A less objective but more clinical indication is a worsening clinical status. This has to be decided by the treating physician. More objective indications include complications in the form of infection, bleeding, rupture, and obstruction of the CBD or the duodenum. Any doubt of malignancy, as we've seen, any differential with a high index of suspicion for cystic neoplasm, or a failure to resolve with an increasing size are indications to intervene. Now, when to intervene? This is the PANTER trial. Suppose that all surgical residents and DM residents must know. This is a landmark cited more than 1,500 times. Must know what PANTER stands for. It's pancreatitis necrosectomy versus a step-up approach. 88 patients were taken with an intention to treat analysis, and they compared open necrosectomy versus a step-up approach in which patients underwent a PCD, subsequently revised in 72 hours if required, followed by minimal invasive necrosectomy if required. The end point of this study was organ failure, major complication in the form of viscous perforation or death. The endpoint was achieved in 69% of patients who underwent open necrosectomy. So 69% of these patients had any of these complications versus 40% in those who had a step-up approach. 1/3 of these patients, or 35% of these patients who were undergoing a step-up approach, could only be managed with a PCD. So we're only doing a singular procedure. What did it result in? Apart from lower endpoint reached in the step-up approach, these patients had lower organ failure, had lower incidence of new onset diabetes, and a lower incidence of incisional hernia. However, the mortality was equal between these two groups. So this established a clear path forward that interventions must be done and delayed as late as possible, preferably more than 4 weeks, and done in a gradually stepping up approach.
But this is for necrosis.
Yes, sir.
It's
This
not
is for
pseudosis.
not for
This is
pseudosis.
for necrosis.
Now, treatment options for pancreatic pseudosis are multiple. We discussed that you can observe these patients and do nothing. You can do a percutaneous catheter drainage, do an endoscopic internal drainage in the form of a cystogastrostomy, cystoduodenostomy, or approach these cysts through a transpapillary or pancreatic duct technique. Surgical interventions are again similar: cystogastrostomy or cystoduodenostomy, a cystoduodenostomy, and the others include an LPJ or a pancreatic resection, which I'll be briefly covering later on, followed by an external catheter drainage. Now, what all is required? What all do we look at before we plan our treatment? So, number one, of course, I've not mentioned the symptoms. The symptom decides what treatment approach we do. The thickness of the wall, between 3 mm and 1 centimeter is preferable. The location of the cyst, the contents of the cyst, the number of the cysts, and the status of the duct. Now, it's clear. I wanted to clarify for the students that we must, whenever you're speaking in the exams, differentiate between saying drainage and saying necrosectomy. A drainage procedure drains the fluid. A necrosectomy removes the necrotic tissue. These terms are not interchangeable, and you will get caught out if you use them incorrectly. What's important to note is drainage and necrosectomy can be done by the same approaches. So drainage can be done by percutaneous, necrosectomy can be done percutaneously. Similarly, drainage can be done, transgastric or enterally. Same thing can be approached, but the necrosectomy can also be done by these same approaches. Now, what are these routes? The 5 common routes that we take are they're not in any particular order. So R1 is per os transpapillary. We can see it here. Is my mouse not visible? Okay, so R1 is per os transpapillary. R2 is per os transmural. Here you're going through a viscera. You're going orally, going through a viscera, but not through the pancreatic duct. R3 is percutaneous but retroperitoneal. R4 is percutaneous but transperitoneally. And R5 is percutaneous and going transmurally or transgastrically as required. Now we move on to the first one, which is the endoscopic cystogastrostomy. Okay, sir. So endoscopic cystogastrostomy has a direct puncture through the posterior wall of the stomach. Preferably, it is EUS guided. It's placement of plastic stent or stems, or as lamps, as Sir has said, which is now the new modality being used. The success rate is between 1500%, depending upon the indication, chronic or acute pancreatitis, and whether what are the contents of the cyst cavity, whether it is necrotic or clear fluid. The prerequisites for endoscopic drainage require the cyst to be close to the GI wall. It needs to be, if you're planning a transmural procedure, needs to have a bulge in the adjacent wall, a good sized cyst that can be decompressed, and we need to check if there is any potential debris. A large amount of debris, which is more in favor of an infected one or a large one, will have a lesser incidence, lesser success rate as compared to a simple pseudocyst. Now, this one, endoscopic cystogastrostomy, just a picture. We see a large cyst pressing upon the stomach, and subsequently it's been decompressed with a stent placed between the two cavities. The same procedure can be expanded, and a necrosectomy can be done through a peroral route. It is, however, cumbersome, takes time, and then you need an expert endoscopist for it. However, it is definitely better tolerated than an open necrosectomy.
I think we'll leave the endoscopic part
later.
To go
Right.
to the surgical.
So just one thing, transpapillary drainage is also a procedure. It's done. It's technically challenging. It may require multiple stent exchanges. And this is the last study that I wanted to just say that transmural drainage, if can be, I'll skip this long study, so I'll skip this. Now moving on to the surgical bit. Now open cystogastrostomy is what was traditionally taught. It is done in large cysts which are present in close apposition to the stomach. An anterior gastrotomy is done. The cyst is aspirated. The cyst is identified at the most. The gastrotomy is done at the most prominent area of the bulge. The anterior stomach is opened. The cyst is aspirated. If there's any suspicion of a neoplasm or any cystic neoplasm, a section is sent for frozen and biopsy. And at least a 3 centimeter stoma is treated to create an open cystogastrostomy, and the anterior layer is then closed. This is taken from Kapoor sir's book. This is what an open cystogastrostomy looks like. And a salient point is interlocking sutures are used in between the cyst cavity to avoid any troublesome bleeding. For a laparoscopic cystogastrostomy, this is now mostly, if the option is available to patients, this is standard of care. For those patients who require it, we identify the bulge at the most prominent part of the stomach. An anterior gastrotomy, the steps remain the same: fluid aspiration, opening the cyst cavity. We clear the cyst contents and any debris that lies inside it, and an anastomosis is done, followed by closure. An additional point for students is important to remember is that you must remember and say in their exams that if the indication for, if the etiology for pancreatitis was biliary, you do a simultaneous cholecystectomy in the same setting.
This is important not only from exam but even from practical patient management point of view. I think every center has had a case where it was forgotten.
A cystojejunectomy is the alternative. It is done in a roux loop is formed to separate the digestive contents and enteric contents from the cyst cavity. The advantage of this is that it is very versatile. It can be used at any location of the pancreatic pseudocyst. Multiple cysts can be drained via a single roux loop, can also be used for doing a CBD drainage in those patients in which it is required. This is taken from Shackelford, just a standard cystogastrostomy, cystojejunectomy, where a window is created inside the transverse mesocolon, a roux loop is brought up, and an anastomosis is done between the cyst and the jejunum. Now, this is important for patients for pseudocysts associated with chronic pancreatitis. Doing only a cyst drainage will not be sufficient. Drainage procedure for a chronic pancreatitis, which may include a phrase or an LPJ, has to accompany the treatment modalities. And it's important to note, and this is said in more than one text, that if you don't drain the pseudocyst, but you drain the duct, the pseudocyst will resolve. But if you drain the pseudocyst and do nothing to the duct, you will be unable to treat the patient. So the ductal drainage is more important than the pseudocyst drainage. Now, just 2 papers, the most recent paper coming out between endoscopic and laparoscopic drainage, which one is an RCT which came out, 30 patients each, which showed that patients' success rate was the same. There was no difference in the success rate, and the overall outcome was also good. However, patients who underwent an endoscopic approach were able to be discharged earlier, had an earlier oral allowance, and had a slightly easier post-operative course. However, what was required, what was important in these patients, is that in the patients who had endoscopic drainage, there was a higher requirement for repeat procedures as compared to a laparoscopic, simple laparoscopy. This is because in this particular series, the authors felt that there was a higher incidence of infection that happened in the cyst contents. Now, this largest study that I could find is the meta-analysis between these 2 modalities, which showed that the therapeutic success was equal, the adverse events were equal. However, endoscopic proved to be cheaper and with a shorter hospital stay. Just a few words on external drainage. So, external drainage is used commonly. It's used with knowing the risk that we can create an external pancreatic fistula. It's mainly used in sepsis. It's used as a temporizing alternate or a bailout measure in patients who have peritonitis or bleeding. The important thing to note is that unlike the other modalities we have discussed, we do not need to have a mature wall. we're able to go percutaneously, so we can intervene in these patients at less than 4 weeks when the cyst is still being formed, when the cyst is not mature. Now, how do we drain? Now, simply enough, if the collections can be in 3 places. If it's a lateral or a flank collection, you prefer a lateral or a retroperitoneal drainage. If it's present medially, you can do a transluminal drainage or an endoscopic drainage. If it is overlying a viscous, then we do a percutaneous or transperitoneal approach. Now, important points to note when you're telling your intervention radiologist, you go for the shortest track in a gravity dependent drainage. You try to go as laterally as possible. This will allow you subsequently to intervene in case you want to do a percutaneous or a nephroscopic necrosectomy. Try to place a single drain if required. Go and place multiple drains. There are multiple collections. Have a low threshold for intervention for re-intervention in case the drain is not working, and try to go for a slightly larger size drain if you feel that the collections are viscous or have a component of necrosis. Just to show you, it's a laterally placed drain. This is how a PCD will look, which is upsized. This is a sheath being placed. Necrosectomy is done, the necrosum is removed, and a drain is placed into the cavity. Resection procedures are uncommonly done. They're done in 2 cases predominantly. It's done if the cyst is in relation to the tail of the pancreas with a disconnected duct and a small pancreatic parenchyma at the tail left. It's not just a little bit of pancreatic parenchyma at the end. Or it is done in case there is a pseudocyst in the head of the pancreas, in which we're going to resect it while doing a phase procedure. Just now, last few slides. What is the algorithm? This is from Shackelford. So a cystic lesion with a history of pancreatitis. First step, you rule out the neoplasm. We've discussed this. Now we know it's a pseudocyst. It is symptomatic. If it's not symptomatic, you observe, and if it's not growing in size, do nothing. However, if it's symptomatic or it continues to grow, you go for a drainage procedure. Just before you proceed for a drainage, you look and rule out any disconnected duct syndrome. If there is a disconnected duct and it's the duct is not wide enough for anastomosis, you just remove the distal part. If it is wide enough for anastomosis, you do a Roux-en-Y pancreatic vaginostomy. Now, if the imaging does not suggest chronic disconnected duct and the patient has chronic pancreatitis, again you go for a Roux-en-Y pancreatic vaginostomy. If he does not have chronic pancreatitis, you go ahead and do an endoscopic or a surgical internal drainage procedure. Once we've ruled out that there is no ductal communication between the PD and the pseudocyst, you can either proceed for a cystogegnostomy or a cystogastrostomy based on the location of the cyst. If there is a ductal communication, this is where the role of transpapillary pancreatic duct stent comes in. So just a final take-home message: pseudocysts arise in chronic pancreatitis and acute pancreatitis. Most of them, these are 2 common etiologies. It's important to differentiate cystic neoplasms from a pseudocyst. Not all of them require treatment. Only those who have symptoms or complications need to be intervened. Evaluation of ductal anatomy helps us in treatment planning, and we have a number of treatment options from endoscopy, surgery, and intervention radiology to choose from for the best treatment. Thank you.
Take questions from the students. So, students, you can ask Dr. Shashwat, and I would suggest that keep your questions related to endoscopic intervention in reserve, because we will have a special lecture by Dr. Saraswat. So you can ask them at that time. But if you have any other questions, please feel free to ask. So before any student asks, Ajay, any comment?
I do have some of the important points. I think the Shashwat has very beautifully described the pseudocysts, at least at the level of students level as well as for the faculty, that what the concepts are. I think if you go to the first slide, they were mentioned there is a secondary rise in the amylase and lipase. I think it should also include that it should be a persistent rise of amylase and lipase. So secondary rise is not the only answer. It is also persistent. The patient has a amylase on day 1, he has a amylase rise on day 3rd month also, it has to be. Second thing is, you said sonography has 92% sensitivity, and I think that's a very important point, because for sonologist, the most important thing is the sonologist which you have. because it is able to not see that collection in that area. Second thing is the preparation that you have. And third thing is the size of the pseudocyst that you have. So these three important factors will determine the sensitivity of the sonography for a pseudocyst. Next thing is you mentioned about CT scan. I think in CT scan the very important thing as for the surgeons as well as maybe from the endoscopic perspective is the vascular architecture between the stomach and the pseudocyst that you have, where you plan a intervention, whether it is surgical. So that is always to be seen. Other than the maturity of the wall, the thickness of the wall, the necrosis, the area which you are planning to drain. So in that reference, again, the stomach, if it is not approximating with the pseudocyst, then your surgical option is definitely goes down the list, at least in the form of a cystogastrectomy. It will go more in the terms of cystogastrectomy. So you should always take into consideration how much of the cyst is approximating the stomach wall, and the area where it is approximating the stomach wall, the vessels which are seen in that area, if you have dilated veins in that area, always be cautious. This is very common problem with this patient of pseudocyst. Going in terms of CT scan again, just missed what I was doing. There was some more important thing in terms of
And actually that point which Ajay said, US is the best modality to look at that. I think that is a big advantage which endoscopists have when they are draining it into the stomach.
Looking for collaterals or versus splenic vein, portal vein thrombosis is not uncommon. 10 to 20% may have thrombosis plus the distance. And then US guided drainage can be done for non-bulging cysts, cysts that are distant at a distance of within 1 to 2 centimeters from, but not bulging into the lumen where standard drainage is not possible. There are advantages to it. And the solid component also, identification, US are the most reliable techniques to identify the solid component in the cyst.
Yeah, I also have all these tips for some of these points to be discussed, but I thought that will come at US, but good that has come beforehand. Now, second thing I think that's for important for students, and this has been a query for in my mind as well for a long time. I think we have two senior teachers here with us, they can elaborate. A cystogastrostomy does not drain the contents of stomach into the pseudocyst, but a cystogegnostomy will drain the contents of jejunum into the pseudocyst. I don't know what is the rationale behind it. What we have learned over these years is if as soon as you drain, it gets decompressed. So if it gets decompressed for a cystogastrostomy, it should get decompressed for a cystogegnostomy as well. But for a cystogegnostomy, you always need a hulu. But for a cystogastrostomy, you don't need any of those principles. I'm still confused. So maybe Kapoor can guide on that.
What I have seen at table is that as soon as you open the, because it is not a true cyst, it is actually, it has created space for itself in the tissue, in the space which was not there. So it collapses as soon as you drain it. And second is that in some patients, for some reason, when we did a CT scan, we didn't find anything in that area, just some inflammatory residual thickening. So I don't know whether the cysts which are drained in jejunum do not collapse. I'm sure they also collapse because it is easy to make a Roux-en-Y loop in jejunum. We all conventionally do that. I don't know if anybody has reported simple loop for jejunostomy. Nobody probably dared to do because it is such an easy option. Whereas in the stomach you have no other option.
So possibly if we need to give it a try sometime. And taking a risk, and then maybe somebody on this earth happens.
So I read the literature. It says the book. I don't remember which book, but one of the books clearly states that Roux limb is created because there is definite risk of enteric contention in the cyst cavity. It says very clearly. So I don't know whether it's been tried. There's a randomized trial, but the book states.
I agree with you, Sarthak, because this has been a traditional teaching which is going on for the last 50 years. So we have been, yes, that is what we have been taught. That is what we have been doing. Therefore, I told, in spite of so many years of doing it, I still don't have an answer. That's how I started this question.
So still there are chances of the content, gastric content going down into the cyst.
But same holds true for choledochoduodenostomy. When we do a choledochoduodenostomy, there is always a possibility. But what has been said, whether it is proven by evidence or not, is that if there is a wide stoma and it becomes a to and fro movement, it doesn't cause any problem. That is what
we feel drainage. should be freely breathed.
But there's an anti-gravity done, isn't it? The content, gastric content goes down into the cyst cavity. The cyst cavity is anti-gravity.
That is more harmful
More
than a
harmful.
cystogestnoscopy. So cystogestnoscopy should be not without any rule. So you are standing in favor of the
Cystogestnoscopy rule cystogestnoscopy will be better than comparing.
then you are going against your statement now. Na? Then Lulu is not required. Stomach content going into the pseudocyst is more harmful. That's what you
Yes,
want to
sir,
say.
but harmful.
But the jejunal loop, it is a gravity dependent. So it should not go into the cyst. The jejunal loop should come out into the pseudocyst. Now, about one thing about drainage procedure, I think, Sasha, that we have missed one point, which is very important for all the students to know, that drainage procedure is not just a percutaneous direct drainage of the cavity. What endoscopically is being done, as Dr. Asaf has said, is also being practiced now by intervention radiologists. They do a transgastric drainage. I remember Dr. Vaidya doing it. Now most of the people in the country do it. Transgastric cystogestoscopy. Only thing is they will place a fine catheter on first stage. They will decompress it, and then they will place a metallic stent into the cystogestoscopy. What is classic place? I think sir will be able to elaborate it more.
Actually, what people are doing normally for a transgastric. So sorry, talking about transgastric placement, you normally anterior wall, posterior wall, either a double pigtail or a double flower malicose is placed, which ensures percutaneous drainage of the cyst collection. And even in places where there is a ductal communication or a disrupted pancreatic duct, the standard practice there would be if after 4 weeks or so, a large volume of pancreatic juice is still draining. You can internalize the transgastric thing by cutting the cutaneous flower and letting the catheter go into the stomach. So it will stay there for a long time, and I've pulled out a lot of these internally placed ones. Double pigtails tend to migrate, but double flower malicose, you cut off the cutaneous flower, the retroperitoneal flower is in place, that has to be mechanically pulled out, and you leave it for a few months. All communications close, the duct strictures, and the leak stops. So that is what we do with transgastric.
I think that is very nicely described by sir. Second thing, whenever you do a drainage in a pancreatic pseudocyst, almost 70% time you will find some necrosome. I have hardly found any pseudocyst. So it is not only drainage also. It is a drainage with necrosectomy together. I will describe it as two procedures now. I think that is almost always a drainage with necrosectomy and necrotic material, which is now actually not infected. So it is just a necrotic tissue lying over there. Otherwise, it should be abscess.
One just to counter to that is that we are not actively removing the necrosome. So it's still a drainage procedure. When we do a necrosectomy, it means we're removing the necrosomes. That's what literature says, that there are two separate nomenclatures. We do a PCD, we get the necrosome, that's still drainage. We go inside, do a necrosectomy endoscopically or surgically, that is a necrosectomy.
I agree with what you are saying. If you are doing a surgical procedure, you are done a cystogestoscopy, you find a necrotic tissue over there, you will try to remove it, you will never leave it.
Yes, agree.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
So it is a
Drainage with necrosectomy.
Yes.
So
They're both.
I would say that this is almost always, it is very rarely it happens that it is a drainage without a necrosectomy. Rulu with cystogestoscopy, we already touched that, I think. In your trial, you have said that more procedures are required with an endoscopic procedure as compared to laparoscopic. I think that was in that.
Sir, in one study that I have done, yeah.
So let me come to that now. I think Dr. Asaf is here who can elaborate on that. That whenever you are doing an endoscopic procedure, there is always a smaller stent which is placed. So they tend to get blocked or they tend to get infected, and as compared to vis-a-vis if you do a laparoscopic procedure or a surgical procedure, it is minimum 3 centimeter size. Earlier it was 7 centimeter size, but minimum 3 centimeter size you drain. So that is a relatively larger size. So maybe that's the cause, or there is some other cause.
I mean, that particular study.
In this trial, did they use lamps?
No, sir, that's regular, sir.
So that is what I was
That's what
saying.
exactly, sir.
What is the largest
That's
trial
regular.
that
लेंस के ट्रायल्स अब आ रहे हैं
अब आएंगे sir.
This is the oldest
It's the oldest
study,
study, 2020.
Plastic stent was, and Dr. Ajay's criticism of plastic stents is perfectly valid. Whenever we do a standard freehand approach to cystogastrostomy endoscopically, you use a CRE balloon to open it up to even 12 or 15 millimeters, but you leave one or two 10 French stents only. And that is good enough for fluid, but certainly inadequate for pus or thick content.
Agreed.
But currently now you've moved on to lamps, and to answer Dr. Kapoor's question, I think the lamps are about 2 centimeters long, They have flowers at both ends, which will be up to 25 millimeters, and the shaft will open up to a diameter of 15 to 18 millimeters. So that gives very good drainage. Not only does it give good drainage, it allows a route for the endoscopist to access the WOPN and then go in and do multiple sessions of cystogastroscopy. Necrosectomy and clear the necrotic tissue.
Now, one more thing important about PCD is that indications of PCD are usually not the classical patients who require either surgical or endoscopic drainage. The PCD is the group of patients which you have to emphasize that for the students at least, that they are early symptomatic patients. Suppose the patient gets non-mature cyst, as you have mentioned, early symptomatic patients. Second group is more infection complication in that group. And third thing is, in spite of a longer duration, the cyst wall is not maturing that we find. So in that case, we are always hesitant to go in surgically or by endoscopic measures. So these 3 points have to be emphasized in this group of patients. Last, you have not mentioned. I think one thing that needs elaborate on that is nowadays once you have done a percutaneous necrosectomy, percutaneous drainage of the procedure, you put in a drain in that area. Now what we do is now we pass a nephroscope through this drain and then we do a necrosectomy. You put yes. So that's what we do nowadays.
Yeah.
That means
You kind of doing a necrosectomy and the endoscopic view. So you do an endoscopy.
so we are taking some of the seat now.
Everything management is becoming hybrid and combined, and that is excellent. Now, one quick point that I'd like to add here is basically regarding the maturity of the cyst wall in the context of endoscopic drainage.
Yes, sir.
I think as far as the surgeon is concerned, you have to place sutures, you have to have ties and so on. So you want a mature cyst in the last point. But for the endoscopist, if the bulge is there, you can puncture and you can oppose. I think maturity is a secondary consideration. It's a wonderful way for it.
I have a doubt, sir.
Yes.
Sometimes we will find a lot of pseudocysts. One is situated at the one larger one is 4 into 6 centimeter at the head. One extremely far away from the head. If a patient having 2 or 3 cysts or sometimes 4 to 5 cysts, then what will be the treatment modalities or what will our approach to address? How we will address that?
I would say if you are going in for a surgical drainage of the large cyst which is close to the pancreas, then the other cysts, if possible, you drain into the same loop, jejunal loop.
No, sir.
But if they are definitely distant, remote cysts, then obviously there is no ductal communication. They are just collections. You can either aspirate them, you can marsupialize them, whatever you do, because they are not going to refill again.
So we have to address all those cysts.
Should.
Oh, should we?
If you are already in, you should. Yes.
I think we close
Yeah,
this.
I think we will close this. So thank you everyone who attended. And as I said that we will have a special session on therapeutic endoscopy, and if the students, I would be happy if the students give us a feedback on whether they would want a broad lecture by Dr. Saraswat on therapeutic endoscopy or whether you would want any specific area. So based on it, please send your suggestions to Dr. Nagar. Don't put them on the group. To block the group, send them individually to Dr. Nagar. He will compile the responses and then we will request Dr. Saraswat to cover that in the month of December. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.